Hello.
Hello.
How's it going?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well too.
Cool.
You want to talk about Sopranos?
Yeah. I mean,
Key episode.
a hard episode to talk about. A pretty
Yeah. Visceral reaction to this episode.
So I don't really love talking about this episode in a lot of ways. It's pretty hard to watch and hard to talk about.
It is.
Yeah. So that's it, I guess.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
Yeah.
No, but I think there is a lot to kind of unpack. And I mean, clearly this episode was rather revolutionary just for the way that it portrayed a rape scene. I mean, it's just so gritty and real.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, I think, done in a way that people really expected on TV. Even now, looking back in 2018, I mean, I still can't really think of other episodes that have done anything like that. Or sorry, any other shows that have done anything like that.
No, I know what you mean. I think like we're a little bit more like, I don't know. We're showing harder and harder things on TV and in movies now. Like there's more space for it, I guess, or more, I don't know, like desire to explore some of those harder issues, I guess.
Yeah.
But back then that would have been crazy.
Yeah.
I actually remember when because my parents watched this show before I did. I was like an older teenager.
Yeah.
And I remember like coming upstairs, you know, when they were watching it at night or whatever, like at different times. And I remember when they were watching this episode, they told me to go downstairs.
Right.
And I was a teenager, you know, like, but they were like, no, you can't watch this.
Yeah.
That was like something that
Right.
they didn't want to expose me to. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's interesting, like with this episode, like in light of kind of like the Fortunate Son stuff last week too, right? Like, what does it mean to protect certain people from information or from a lifestyle or whatever? What does it mean, like how Melfi's son shows up at the hospital
Right.
afterwards? So I don't know. I think there's definitely important things. I think there's also, and we can like choose what we want to talk about, I guess, but I think there's also a lot in this episode around like what it really means to take someone back. So we have it like with Melfi and Tony. Obviously, we're still continuing to kind of like understand why she took Tony back as a patient or why she's so hesitant to like not let him go as a patient.
Yeah.
We see that she's taken back her ex-husband, Richard. I had one other thing in my head, but I forgot it at this point.
Okay. Yeah.
But maybe it'll come back to me. So I think like there's an aspect of that too that I kind of want to explore.
Right.
And then I don't know. What else?
Yeah.
Would you have anything else
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that like Melfi as a character is really unfolding in this episode, and I think it goes deeper than just the rape scene. I mean, I think there's also a really like deep investigation of why she needs Tony Soprano in her life. And I think that this episode sets up something where she could use Tony for something in her life that she couldn't get from anywhere else. And that's something that she really struggles with and ultimately makes a decision on in the end of the episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I think that it's a pivotal episode for her in a lot of ways. Obviously, this is a pivotal, catastrophic
moment in her life.
That she would be struggling with for the rest of the time that she's alive. But I think that she also makes some decisions that alter the course of the rest of the show and change her relationship with Tony in particular.
Yeah, there's a lot. What do you want to kind of start with talking about?
Well, I know you were interested in the first scenes and the way that they unfolded, so I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, I just kind of in light of that, like, you know, what it means to like take people back kind of thing. I just thought it was I mean, this is an incredible episode. Like, let's just put that out there. I know we say that all the time. I think this is an episode that like it's almost like a standalone episode in some ways. Like I don't know. It guides you through this progression. And we have, you know, like this rape scene happening almost in the very middle of the episode. So like that, you know, just like, I don't know, the arc of this episode is really interesting. And it kind of does tell in some ways like a full story about this event and the things that are going on around it. But we have the first scene we have is Irina calling the Soprano household, right?
Yeah.
and Carmela answering the phone. Or sorry, Tony answering, Carmela not answering the phone. Yeah, that would be weird. Carmela saying, "Can you get it?" Right? So like she could have answered the phone.
Right.
And it's Irina. And she's all like dressed in black with boots and stuff like that. But she always says that to Tony whenever, like we had her saying it last week too, when she was over at Livia's house around the leg, like being like, "I miss you, Tony.
Yeah.
Come back to me," kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so we have him still being strong about not taking her back. And I don't really it's hard for me to understand his motivations for not taking her back. Like I don't really get why.
Well, there's something really fascinating about this episode, and I find that they portray Tony in a more humanizing light than they often do. In fact, when you look at the actions that Tony takes in this episode, like
he comes across
not going back to Irina, also like really trying to keep Jackie out of trouble
and caring for Melfi like in a very genuine way.
Caring for Melfi, caring for Christopher. It's really interesting. They really kind of like throw a wrench into our assessment and understanding of Tony Soprano as this villain because there's a lot of actions that he takes that humanize him. So it is just like it's another complication to the way that we see him as a character.
But it's hard for me to understand like his motivation. Like I don't really see his like
why did he leave Irina?
Well, not like I kind of understand why he left Irina. But I don't understand why he wouldn't just take her back. I don't see like his like desire to be with Carmela as the reason why. I don't like. I'm just not sure what it is. It seems
like he like reached a point where he wasn't attracted to who Irina was as a presence in his life and who she was. And he
wasn't attracted to someone who would be attracted to him or want to be with him. I think right. So maybe that's still lingering there.
Right.
I don't know, but she's like clearly making it easy for him if he wanted to do that, and we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens there. Anyways, but the second scene then we have is Richard and Melfi being back together. Richard Lapenna and Jennifer. They refer to her by her first name a lot in this episode.
Yeah. Also cue the and I'll talk about this later, but like the cut from Irina wearing all black on the black phone, Tony wearing all white on the white phone, and then an edit. Richard, he's like cutting parsley, and it's like all green in the frame, which just kind of stands out compared to the whites and blacks. And I'll come back to it later because I actually think that use of color kind of relates to a few other things.
No, I agree.
That edit at that point I thought was relevant.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like we don't get any, we see Melfi at one other time having a romantic partner, right? The last time we saw Richard, they were, they're like co-parenting Jason or whatever, and they seem to still be friendly, but we don't have a sense of how long ago they broke up, of what their relationship was like back then.
Yeah.
We just have this kind of like vague sense of who he is, and he was kind of an asshole when we last encountered him. He was pretty belligerent. He continues to be like, not my favorite character. Yeah. I love how he even refers to himself as Dick Lapenna in this episode, which like he was kind of using as a power thing at one point, but he is a dick. I really don't like that guy. But it's hard for us to understand, like with all that, with what little we know about what Melfi is going through in her conundrum about taking Tony back and having Tony as a patient. We know she's going through something, but this is also somehow part of it, right? This is something that somewhere in the meantime has happened. And she's made this choice. And she refers to it like later in the episode a little bit. Like she talks about how, like what was like with Kupferberg, she was like, what was I thinking? Like, of course, like I married a man 10 years older than me. Like, I forget if she says it. Like of course he would like be paternalistic.
Or something. Yeah.
I can't find it on my notes right now, but so there's like clearly something that drew her back to him or him back to her. I mean, vice versa. So that was like interesting to me in terms of how that's connected to her taking Tony back, because they use that kind of language around both, right? Like, he says something about her taking him back in that scene. And then we have a scene in Melfi's office, right? So we go from just this Tony to Richard and Melfi to a scene in Melfi's office where she kind of starts to agree with the things that Richard says about Tony and the things that Kupferberg says about Tony, because he wasn't taking things seriously, right? She thought they had this major breakthrough. Right. He didn't even remember to keep this log of his thoughts and associations, right? And then we have Melfi with Kupferberg. I don't know. I just really liked this sequence, right? So then we have Melfi with Kupferberg, and he's saying, like, why did you take him back, right? They're talking about Tony, but then they all are also talking about Richard, right? And that's when she does mention, like, Richard, he's older. I think she says, like, more patronizing or something like that. Like, so this is, like, this other relationship that she has. And they talk about how psychotherapy is limited for anxiety disorder. So I don't know. I just saw these 4 opening scenes as, I don't know, highlighting these multitudes of relationships between those 4 characters, I guess, right? Like, we don't see any other characters besides Tony, Irina, Melfi, and Richard. Yeah. And all of them have these kind of like complex, except I guess Irina and Richard are not related in any way, but all of them have these kind of like complex, intertwined relationships that require this kind of like accepting someone back into your life or not accepting them, and what that really means in terms of like how that relationship is in the context of others. I guess we see Elliot Kupferberg too, so I take that back. Right. I don't know why Melfi continues to work with him. I think she should she should leave him behind. Yeah, I don't know. They just stood out to me, and they were all. Like, it was just like the sequence. I actually found myself watching this episode, like noting down, because I've seen the show before. I know that the rape scene is coming, and so I was paying attention to where in the episode that falls. Right. And it's really like, you know, give or take my notation, it's about like the 10th scene only.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of other things that happen in this episode. Yeah. And I mean, this episode deals with, if you think about that scene as being kind of like the central part of the episode, there's a lot of fallout that happens after that the episode is dealing with. But there's a lot that happens before that's just unrelated too. So, you know, like you said, like it's a standalone episode. It is, but there's a lot of other things that are going on. And the story is developing for characters that have nothing to do with that. I mean, Johnny Sack is completely unrelated to that drama. It's just such a powerful scene that I think when people reflect on this episode, that's what kind of
I mean, it's also out. It's like the title is related to it and stuff like that. So I do see it as central.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Obviously.
Definitely central.
I even see, I don't know, like kind of what you were saying about Tony, like the way that Tony's portrayed in this episode. Like, I think like the scenes that we do see give us a lot of insight, give us a lot of that, right? They give us these kind of different perspectives on Tony. Yeah. So even when like, it's like 2 scenes before the rape scene, Furio and Tony meet Ralphie in like a weird parking lot pizza restaurant. It's a really weird, like it's the way that it's positioned in the parking lot is very strange. But anyways, Furio and Tony show up and they're, you know, Tony's going to talk to Ralphie about how he's put Gigi in charge of the crew, right? But before that, they talk about Jackie Aprile. And Tony says something like, he's like, being a parent, that's the hardest part. Like, he's like trying to give Ralphie actually some advice or like, you know, like it's about being, you know, kind of a father to this Jackie, right? Like he's dating Rosalie. I don't know. He's like actually kind of, you know, trying to be on the same team. But then he says something, I wrote it down. He says something about like having bad tendencies, like that Ralphie has these bad tendencies, and he says, I've got them too. Yeah. And I think like, and he's like being pretty open and I don't know, like frank with Ralphie about that at that time. You don't really see him kind of like admit that he's wrong, or you know what I mean? Right. But like in this moment, he kind of like does try to connect with him and like explain, and he like, you know, tries to help him to understand it at least, which we know that Ralphie's crazy. Yeah. And he doesn't understand that.
Ralphie definitely starts to be established as a crazier person.
Oh yeah, I wrote it right here. Episode. Ralphie is a crazy.
Ralphie is a crazy.
Which I think I didn't finish my sentence.
Ralphie is a crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, actually, a progression of scenes there where you were talking to him about being a father.
Yeah.
Like, what's plaguing Tony in this episode?
Yeah.
Like, his problems when he goes to
Melfi
the
in
session
the
with
beginning.
Melfi, and she says, "Are you happy?" And that kind of largely goes unanswered. And then it changes into this diatribe about his issues with AJ, or maybe more just like stories about AJ. And then actually that has this weird kind of fade out, and then it kind of just like leaves it, goes into Kupferberg's scene where Melfi is talking to him. And actually that's really interesting because at that point they introduce the idea of Melfi recognizing that she's been conned by a sociopath.
Right.
Which is something that starts to come back a lot in this show.
Right.
But then also, that also is very shortly leading into the scene with Ralphie bringing Jackie to the guy's brother-in-law, this guy who operates the route, and obviously we're seeing a much more violent side of Ralphie, and it's it's identifying him as crazier than what we're even used to in the mob family.
Yeah. I was gonna say something. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, he smashes
The toy airplane.
with a phone, with a white phone.
Ooh, there's so many phones. Okay,
I know.
I can't even hold back, but it's complicated to decipher what the implications could be, because, and we've talked about, especially in season 1, the use of phones, black or white phones, kind of signifying different things. But there's a lot in this episode. That very first scene, Tony and Irina, Tony on white phone, Irina on black phone. Later, Melfi calling Carmela, Melfi black phone, Carmela white phone. Then we have Richard Lapenna calling the detective, Richard, on a white phone. There's, for something that they established in season 1 as a symbol, it's interesting to see the way that it's kind of creeping in.
Yeah.
The way that it's creeping in here.
I know. We never see two
And also,
characters
the
on
phone
the
with
same
Ralphie.
color phone.
I know.
And
It's
smashing.
okay.
I know.
Anyway.
It's just something I like. I don't know. It's weird. That's a weird one. I don't know what to say about it. It's worth noting.
Yeah, it is worth noting. And if any of you have better ideas that I can come up with in this moment, then please let us know, because I'm very interested.
Well, and there actually is like quite a bit of communication that happens by phone. And I kind of like think about it in terms of like the wire that the FBI have set up and stuff like that too. Like just kind of these channels of communication. Like we see when he goes downstairs with Christopher, right? Like the people listening outside from the basement and stuff like that. I don't know. There's just something about like the way in which characters are overheard or communicate with each other. I'm not sure.
Well, there's like often like two sides of an issue too, right?
Right.
Like, and we have talked about blacks and whites representing like kind of like a dualism, like a kind of like a duality to seeing the world and issues and having kind of like a right and a wrong or a simplified view. So a lot of the time when there's conflict between characters or two sides of a story, they're kind of represented by two different sides.
I thought black meant death.
White too.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if it's decipherable. I like don't know if like, but I can tell he wants us to pay attention to it. So
I do think it's intentional for sure.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
The thing about, so like, just to go back to kind of like this stuff, like all leading up to the scene with Melfi in the stairwell, we have her, so like you're right, like she came to terms with the fact that she's being manipulated. Yeah. Right? So then we see her in the next, like after that scene with the weird pizza restaurant in a parking lot, that we have a scene in Melfi's office, and that's when she's really pushing like, this change in your course of therapy. I'm going to bring you some reading materials. But then she kind of changes her mind mid-scene. Like Tony's like, you know what, you're right. Like I should, maybe it is time for me to change. Right? Yeah. And then she says no.
Well, that's
right. Kind of like at the end, the ending scene also has a no.
Well, I thought,
but she's like no, and then she kind of backtracks. Like I'm just saying, like we'll start talking about it. I'll bring you some information. Like she kind of goes soft, even though she comes in kind of like hard on him. So I don't know why she changes her mind.
Well, I think there's
really
layers there. So I mean, there's two no's that Melfi gives in that last scene. So there's the no in terms of, Tony saying maybe I am ready for CBT, and Melfi saying no. So she really backs off on her principles.
And that's right before the rape scene.
No, I'm talking about at the very end of the episode.
Oh.
Yeah, where Tony is.
Well, we have it in that earlier scene too.
Right. So I mean, I think there's many actually.
Yeah.
In terms of where the episode ends up, and in terms of like the finality, it's complicated and it's nuanced because there's these two no's. There's the final no that we get of the entire episode, which means that she's not willing to engage with Tony and have him be violent and to solve this problem through his means. But she also says no about him leaving her. So, and we've been dealing with the fallout that she's been having over treating Tony, and we know that it's, a very complicated psychological issue for her. So she actually backs off in terms of letting him leave, but she does not back off on breaking the social compact, as she says. Not contract, I'm not sure why. But
I know. They keep talking about the social compact in this episode. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, again, I never, like, gave Melfi that much attention. Like, I paid attention to Melfi's storyline, obviously. Particularly, like, of course, in this episode, you remember this part. But, like I've said earlier in, like, past times that we've talked about this, I've never seen her quite as, like, problematic as I do this time around. I kind of, like, put the blame all on Tony. Like,
right.
I didn't, like, I've never really...
She's a human character.
She's human, yeah.
Sure,
like, it's not like, like, but I've just never really noticed that, I guess, before. Like, how her psyche and her issues and her dreams all come into play here.
Yeah.
This is just a total aside, but which characters do we see dreams for? We see them for Tony. We see them for Melfi. We see Christopher.
Yeah.
Do we see any other characters' dreams?
Carmela, we see in the show.
Okay.
Good question. At this point, I can't think of any others.
Okay, I couldn't. I didn't remember Carmela, so I could only think of those three.
Right.
But I just find that interesting, like who we get that extra insight into, particularly because there is this part of the show that's about psychotherapy and dreams and like places importance on those.
Yeah.
Too,
Right. Yeah.
And why we get their perspective and not that of other characters, I'm not sure.
Totally. But it's interesting too how whenever Melfi has a dream, it's such a different experience for us as a viewer because it's so broken down for us. Typically, the show is much more ambiguous in terms of when it's dealing with subconscious imagery. But whenever it's with Melfi, because she's an expert and she's often talking about it with Kupferberg, we actually get like a very like literal breakdown of what's going on.
About what's maybe.
So we're actually, maybe. And actually, I think it's problematic. I don't think it's as simple as this is the correct answer. Like it never is in the show.
Kupferberg always wants to pretend that it is.
Right.
He loves that.
And maybe like I want to pretend that there's real answers to this show, but it's difficult. We all do. That's a human.
That's what he's playing with, right?
Yeah.
Like that's our like human desire to like, understand why the phones are black and white, but we can't.
But how about that dream though? It is interesting. We do get a reading of it and I think it's fair. It's a fair assessment that is entirely possible.
Yeah, well, it's funny kind of when it comes. Like, I kind of want to talk about because it actually comes quite a bit late, like later.
It actually comes.
We have a lot of scenes of Melfi prior to that dream.
Yeah,
right?
she's already discovered Jesus.
Yeah, she doesn't have the dream right away, right? So after that scene in Melfi's office, we see her going down the stairs, and that's when we see this rape scene happening, right? She's talking to Richard on the phone. We do note the guy coming down the stairs, right? Like we have some camera emphasis on him. So we look at his face. I think she also, like she's able to identify him. So she has looked at his face as well. And then we have, that really awful scene. And then right afterwards, we have Melfi in the hospital, right? Yeah. Directly after. We have Richard coming and caring for her kind of thing, in this very Richard way. And he's mad. Right. And throughout the episode.
So is Jason, her son.
Well, Jason's
he's
really mad. He's
yelling.
Like, animals are running wild.
Yeah, the world is a fucking sore. The animals, they're winning.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting concept, too, because in large part in the show, that's true. The people who are taking and doing what they want are rewarded for it. And so it is hard to find recourse for the people that are just hit. In fact, there's even that line from Tony near the end, that's what's wrong with the world, and he's saying an innocent person is driving along and some asshole comes and rams into you. And yet, the irony that there's no self-reflection there, that he's one of those assholes ramming into innocent people,
of course,
all over the place. But I think that that's connected to what Jason is yelling about, that these animals are winning. Obviously, Tony has nothing to do with this Jesus Rossi incident, but it is connected in that there are impacts on people who have nothing to do with this world, like the soldiers that Tony talks about. They're not invested in this war. They haven't, signed away their life to this cause, and yet they're still impacted by it.
Yeah, no, totally. It's interesting here. We have these kind of like 3 scenes in a row, or actually like a lot of scenes in a row with Melfi. So we have, and this is why for some reason I felt compelled to do this, but we have Melfi's office, we have Melfi's rape scene, we have Melfi at the hospital, we have Melfi calling the Soprano home, right, to tell, to try to tell Tony, but ends up telling Carmela that she has to cancel Tuesday's appointment or whatever. And then we have a little bit of a scene at the Soprano home right afterwards where Tony's eating celery. I know you wanted to talk about that. I'll give you a second to talk about it in a second.
It's okay.
But then he asks, he kind of broaches the topic of Carmela coming to therapy with him, right? Which he had kind of said, like,
again,
that's
another
never
humanizing incident for him.
Sure.
The fact that he actually does that.
And
I
kind
didn't
of like
expect
this
it.
switch of character in some ways. Like, and Carmela doesn't really respond all that positively. She's
I
kind of
find it
just staring at
complicated
him.
reading her.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I actually think that the way, for me, reading the way Edie Falco's portraying it is she's appearing stone-faced, but underneath she's like melting a little bit. And it's actually, it is something that she wants.
Complicated.
It's complicated. I think she's putting on a stoic act a bit, but it is actually something that she values.
Yeah.
And I think she recognizes the fact that that is Tony going outside of his comfort zone and actually trying to do something for the two of them.
Yeah. No, I think so. But then we get one more scene with Melfi right after that, right? So it's like this very Melfi heavy chunk. We see her on the couch, like waking up from a nap, right? And that's when we have Richard calling the detective and this whole scene that ensues with him talking about the rape and like referring to himself as Dick. Kind of like, and they get into this conversation about how he thought that she should call a security guard when she's in deserted parking garages. So we kind of have him blaming her.
Right.
And then we have one scene between that at the Bing, but then we have her up in bed, right afterwards.
I'm
basically
sorry.
apologizing
and then Richard
to
saying,
him.
I'm just frustrated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you get these little insights into their relationship too through this, right? Anyways, that was just it was just that Melfi heavy chunk that I thought was important. But do you want to talk about celery and parsley?
I would love to talk about celery.
Or we can finish talking about Melfi. And
based on those scenes you just talked about, there was a few things that I noted.
Yeah.
And I think they're all related. So, I mean, one of them is that moment actually where Tony is kind of showing, not remorse, but he's showing, he's caring for Melfi, and basically he's showing, feelings that, she was, albeit in a car crash, and he's eating the stick of celery. I actually thought that was really interesting because we almost never see Tony eating anything healthy.
No.
And the way that the frames are, the way that everything's composed, it's always very intentional that the celery is in the shot, and that he's eating it, and it's almost like crunching. Centered. There's sound effects that are going along with it. For me, it actually kind of related to that earlier scene, perhaps, maybe where there was actually a cut from Tony with like an extremely white and black color scheme to like the frame being kind of like dominated by these greens of Richard chopping the parsley. There's something for me about maybe Tony being out of place in that situation, showing compassion, and also Richard then being out of place later on when he's showing anger and frustration and trying to do something about this, because there's some cuts that seem really intentional. Yeah. The way that, where you were saying Melfi says, I'm sorry, Richard says, I'm just frustrated, and he's angry.
Yeah,
like Jason is.
Like his hands are all punchy.
He's like clenching his fist saying, I would love to do something. I would love to just, kill that guy, but I just can't.
But I can't.
Which obviously Tony could. And then there's a cut to Tony chopping wood from a super low angle. He looks extremely imposing. And again, now it's like, for me, it's like Tony is in his element. Whereas like the domestication of like what Richard was doing, where he was comfortable chopping parsley in the kitchen in the beginning, was kind of his comfort zone.
Yeah.
it was just, there's something that's like tying those characters together a little bit.
They're like these two male characters in Melfi's life, you know, at a minimum, right? Like she's, you know, engaging in this, like, kind of like, that's why that like taking back kind of behavior really stuck out to me, I guess, because she's doing that same thing with both of these male characters. And some of the reasons are overlapping. Like, it is kind of this sense of being protected and being like, when Richard does it, she refers to it as patronizing or, you know, like patriarchal or something, like whatever word it is she uses. But when she, you know, in her dream, you know, with Tony, it's more like as protective.
Right.
So I think she is subconsciously at least comparing and contrasting these two characters, these two men in her life, and kind of, I think that's why we see these. I think that's why in this episode we see these comparisons. It's like kind of putting us into Melfi's position where she has these two contrasting people in her life. I don't know, at this
totally
moment.
And also, I mean, like, Richard does have kind of like antiquated worldviews too. I mean,
well, even him, like the one being the one talking on the phone,
not passing the phone, you know, really having to be prodded for that. And even when she says, you know, that she wants to call them, he says, you know, I just told you everything they told me. I'll call, you know, not you. I mean, he's really like an insensitive person. He's actually like taking over this situation that is, you know, is hers.
Yeah, and again, like for this, like I know they have history, but that's why, like, for this couple, like I want to know, like, when did they get back together? Because, like, you know, if they've been divorced, like there's clearly a lot that they're having to work through at this time, and then you have this event happen, and then like people's reactions, right? I think people like to show their true selves.
Yeah, and also that character would take over that situation. Of
course
is
he
also
would.
Really saying something about him.
Yeah, he's a dick.
He's a Dick Penna.
Yeah, Dick Penna. Dick Lapenna.
Yeah.
Yeah, because then it's really funny, right? Because then I think that, and there's also, like you mentioned again, something to do with how Tony appears to us in this episode. He actually kind of does appear happy in this episode. We can see his tensions, but we see him in some ways like as this kind of like lighter and caring person, or at least he's like holding back his anger, but more than we've seen him, right? So like we see him kind of like grimacing at John Sacramone's house, like he's upset and he's angry, but he's kind of smiling and like making jokes.
Yeah,
we see the same with Ralphie. Like Ralphie's pissing him off and brought Jackie to this.
He actually deals with the issue pretty head on in a pretty responsible manner.
Yeah, and so like we do, like, you know, we kind of see this different side, and I think it is like, how do people react in these kind of like crises or something like that?
Yeah.
It's an interesting one.
Yeah.
Even, you know, like Tony's upset about, you know, people driving into innocent people, right? Like, oh, yes, he can't see how he does that in his own life. He never really sees how what he does impacts other people, but he's at least kind of like upset over this. Like, this is something that he's, you know, he can identify as wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
It's also it's also a fascinating episode because it's a time where the show really identifies multiple characters who are engaging in behavior that's way worse than what Tony does. So, I mean, not only Ralphie, who's starting to be identified as a character who is worse on the spectrum of badness than Tony.
He's so bad.
But obviously what happens to Melfi is also something that Tony wouldn't do.
Yeah.
He wouldn't engage in that kind of behavior. So even if the show wasn't written in a way where Tony was coming across as a more human, more compassionate person, even by relationship to the other people and the actions that are happening in this episode, he fares better. So it complicates our view of everybody because there's a spectrum of behavior, and he's maybe not the worst anymore.
Yeah. Well, and like, you know, she talks about feeling safe.
Yeah.
In her dream, right? Where Tony is this animal, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of like animals running wild or whatever Jason said. You know, we have this dream, right? We hear this car sound. We see this high voltage when digging sign, which I don't think in my dreams I have that clear, like.
I think typically when you're in a dream actually and you look at like something like writing or like numbers or like detailed information, actually it's super unstable, and actually it's pretty impossible to get. But she remembered like the
acronym and stuff. Anyway, that was interesting. have this cola machine, not Coke, but like Acme Cola or whatever. And she's paying for it with macaroni.
Which makes sense, as one does.
And then she's reaching in to get it, and she's stuck. And that's when she sees the dog. She gets one macaroni back for some reason.
Nice.
It's like returned to her. We see Jesus, and then we see him getting attacked by the dog, right? And she says afterwards that like that made her feel safe. She thought the dog was coming for her, but actually it made her feel safe.
Yeah.
So, I don't think Richard Lapenna makes her feel safe.
No, and I actually think that the show like intentionally identifies him as a not powerful character. Like even like Melfi waking up from that dream, he's wearing an eye mask.
Yeah.
Like he's just kind of lying there. Like he's not a powerful character.
No.
And if you contrast that to Tony chopping wood from like the lowest possible camera angle, it's the opposite. It's the opposite thing.
Well, and we see like, we see Melfi like, with stronger views too in some ways. Like she talks about how the justice system is fucked
up. She could have a certain satisfaction in knowing I could have that asshole squashed like a bug. Yeah.
Yeah, but she doesn't want to break the civil compact. Yeah, I don't know. And then so like our final scene, right, that we have alluded to or kind of mentioned, it's Tony saying like he should probably go on to another form of therapy, right? Like even though he's invited Carmela to come, like, we see him kind of like coming around on this thing too. And Melfi says no, and then she bursts into tears, right? And he goes over to her. He's like, do you want to say something? And then, we see this like extreme close up on her face. And she says no. Yeah.
Very definitively.
Really definitively. And, it's whatever. It's the character of Melfi's choice that she did that. But I also kind of like struggle with, like, she's disclosed some things before to Tony. And so what's kind of like helping her to not do that now? Or like what's making her feel safe enough that she's going to be protected from Jesus, who's, back on the loose and working at the wrap store or whatever, wherever his what is it called? It's like something wraps.
I'm not sure. Yeah. I love that scene though there. It was so, because like when she walks in and everybody's wearing the red hats, for me it has this dreamlike quality where we feel like it can't be true. Yeah. Like she's processing it on some kind of like her subconscious is coming like out.
Everyone's
I'm expecting for
hat.
it to be a dream, but it's not.
Yeah.
And I mean that's such like that would be a typical thing for me to associate with dealing with trauma, to see it everywhere. But then there's this fact that in this world, these things are all related and do come back, and that she actually discovers it and could do something about it too. Is really interesting because that's actually separate from her dream. Yeah. That's reality. Yeah. When I saw all those hats, it seems like it's heightened reality and it's impossible.
Yeah. Well, and that happens before her dream too, right? Like I think it's kind of like triggering in some ways of like now she knows where he works. Right? Yeah. Like now she like has this power.
Exactly. Yeah. I think the first time I saw it though, I think I probably thought that it was the beginning of a dream.
Interesting.
Or something.
I can like now that you say that, like I can definitely see that.
Yeah.
But like she doesn't make the connection until she sees his picture.
Right.
Like she doesn't.
Right. Yeah.
She doesn't know that that's where she's going to. Yeah. Where this person would work.
Yeah. And I mean, we definitely have like a heightened from their way of portraying reality in the dream sequence. It's actually like that dream sequence is really, for me, really referencing the last scene of 2001. The Stanley Kubrick movie, which is something that David Chase has talked about in reference to the last scene of the entire show. He said he was trying to get the feeling of that Star Child scene. And actually they do some of the exact same thing. So I think we've started to talk about these POV shots where they identify like a character's perspective and using the camera to show what a character's seeing. And they do that in this dream where you see Melfi's face, establish it. Then we see another shot where we see what she's seeing in that room. Yeah. Except she's there now. Yeah. So there's this like time continuity gap, which works perfectly for a dream. Yeah. Because it doesn't flow sequentially. But that's also, I mean, check out the last scene of 2001. I think you can see a lot of parallels just in terms of the way that it's filmed, and it's definitely borrowing a lot from those scenes.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting like kind of mind fuck, if you will. Like, how do you, like, because we talked about that with Melfi's other dream about seeing Tony. on the windshield or on
Right.
the on the
You're
hood
out
of
of
the,
the woods.
on the hood of the car. And we talked about how like she's looking at herself, looking at Tony
Right.
in this dream, right?
Yeah.
But dreams are weird because, you know, like we're portraying a dream on a television screen, right? Like whose perspective is it viewed from?
Right.
It's kind of viewed from our perspective, right? Like
Yeah.
even in Tony's dreams, like we see him in the dreams. Would he be like an onlooker of that dream? Like, is he seeing himself in the dream or is
Right.
he himself in the dream? It's hard to,
Right.
you know, it's hard to position it when you have to show it on TV.
Yeah.
But I think there is that aspect, like, I think it links into psychotherapy with, like, what it means to kind of, like, look at yourself and analyze yourself, right? And Melfi is engaged in that kind of behavior.
Yeah.
More so than any other character really in the whole show. Like she's actually the one who's kind of taking the time to unpack her own issues.
Yeah.
And really look at herself, right? And I think in this episode it is like she would have to deal with herself if she had broken the social compact.
Yeah.
And she's like,
I think we were just saying compact now. The social
I know.
compact.
Is that a thing?
I thought it was social contract.
Me
but-
too. But
Actually, it's interesting because, like, for me, it makes me think of like compact or like garbage. It's like a garbage term. So, like, of those malapropriism, that's the right word, right?
Yep.
Malapropriisms. But they're
a malapropriism for the word
I'm
malapropriism.
all over the place.
Yeah.
But yeah, actually, the fact that it's a social compact, for me, that makes me think of like a garbage compactor, which is obviously such a big part of this show. And they talk a lot about garbage being their bread and butter, the garbage industry. And there's something about them kind of shitting on the social contract and the social order and the fucked up justice system that I think it's intentional that it's a social compact. I didn't expect it coming from characters like Richard Lapenna and Melfi because they're from a different kind of like part of society than the other characters who make those mistakes.
Yeah.
They're supposed to be quote unquote more educated or whatever.
Yeah.
But they still make those mistakes.
I don't know. Maybe some people say that.
Maybe
there's...
just let us know if social compact is a thing.
Yeah, I know. We're Canadian, so maybe
we don't call it that in Canada.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, what else did you want to touch on with this episode?
I mean, the scenes with Johnny Sack are, you know, for Tony walking in, him talking about his great room, separate from his living room. The way that great room is filmed and set up, for me, it's so similar to Tony's great room, or whatever, but bigger. And maybe like the windows are allowing more light. It's just like it's a more inspiring space. And the way that it's filmed is very like imposing camera work.
Yeah, I noted that too.
And, you know, he even talks about how it's separate from his living room. So there's like an aspect of jealousy for Tony as a character that Johnny Sack has more than him and is now like in his domain. And Johnny Sack, I think they really go out of their way to identify him as being different than the Sopranos crew. When he walks into Satrial's and, you know, he's saying, you don't stay up with current events.
Yeah.
He's wearing a suit.
Yeah.
They're all, you know, Gigi Sistone is... Well, all of them are joking about Ginny Sack and her weight,
right?
Which
we'll
keep
come back
watching because there's going to be a lot of impact from weight jokes on Ginny Sack. But Johnny comes in a suit. You know, he's not interested in these kind of like degenerate jokings about weight and coups, I think, as he says.
Yeah.
But you know, and
he called them a bunch of illiterates.
Yeah. So that doesn't sound like something the others would call it. Yeah. But I think he's identified as a character from a different. From a different realm.
But it's interesting that he makes this choice. He and his wife make this choice to move to Jersey.
Yeah.
And he gives some kind of crappy excuses. Like he talks about the schools. Aren't his kids older? Like, does he have kids living at home with him?
Oh,
I feel like his kids are older. Like, that's irrelevant.
I don't know if they've introduced his kids yet, but yeah.
I think they're older.
Yeah, well, at this, you have to think about... Yeah, I mean, probably... Could be in high school.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah,
okay.
could be.
But anyway, I just felt like I like all these excuses, right? Like, and he tries to reassure Tony, like, "Oh, it's just a place for me to live. Like, I'm not trying to get involved."
Yeah.
But we see, like, then he shows up at the
right,
back room of the Bing.
Yeah. Or was it Bing? Okay.
Was,
yeah. Okay.
And is getting like he just like shows up
right.
there while these guys are making jokes about his wife, right? They're not expecting him to show up. He's supposed to be in New York.
Right.
He's not supposed to just be able to show up at the Bing.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, and they feel comfortable to joke about his family.
Of course.
And yet he's there now.
There he is, and he'll stay here.
Yeah. It's interesting. Also, when they turn on the TV, and Assemblyman Zellman, who's we've been briefly introduced to before us, talking about this $25 million beautification project, restoring Newark to its former glory, is interesting that they're all just sitting around talking about or thinking about the profit that's going to come to them.
Yeah.
Like the irony of this beautification project and this like public works project that has been manipulated basically to just siphon money into the pockets of these people.
Out of the beauty of what it's supposed to be. It's
Yeah.
this. There's also a long shot of some ducks during that
That's
segment,
right.
which
Yeah.
is interesting. What about Janice in this
Yeah.
episode?
Yeah, I love my note I wrote about Janice, her great line at the end. I was functioning at a very high level until Richie dies.
Yeah.
She sure
my gosh,
was.
Janice, yeah. I love when she's playing guitar.
Me too.
It's really funny. Like, why is she doing that? She's waiting to get these records back, right? And then, and it's funny, like she when the Russian mafia come and, hit her on the face, she's like, how could you be so callous? And they're like, how could you be so callous?
Yeah.
Like you took
Or,
someone's
fuck you, you're
leg.
callous. Yeah.
Yeah, like, yeah, it's really interesting. And then we see like she's kind of lost this battle, so she's choosing a new tactic now.
Right.
She's doing this religious Janice thing.
Right. And, Tony clearly seeing through it immediately.
Yeah, he's like, we've been here before
Yeah.
with all these things. So, yeah, Janice.
Yeah. How about I have, for Jackie, there's these kind of like characters who have smaller parts in this episode that I think are interesting because I think things still happen for them.
I was going to say Christopher, but I don't know what you're
Yeah.
going to say.
Well, I was actually going to talk about, similar because, Jackie, who's actually kind of been introduced as a parallel character to Christopher or something, like this son character, kind of wayward. In fact, Tony's even talking to Christopher about how they're different, but there's these issues of them,
Yeah,
being in
Christopher's
the same world.
kind of calling him out on his bullshit there.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like, what does
Like
that mean?
it's good enough for me, but it's not
Yeah.
good enough for him, kind of
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Well, and the idea, too, of, like, this conflict now between Tony and Ralphie. Tony wants to keep him out of the business. Ralphie saying someone needs to show him how the real world works. And, obviously Ralphie bringing him into environments that are going to be leading him down an ugly path.
We also see that, maybe Jackie and Meadow, there might be, we see him.
Could be, maybe.
Him and Ralphie talk about Meadow over that meal that they're having together.
Yeah.
Right? When we see Jackie, like, staring at Adriana.
Yeah.
Meadow comes up, and then we see them interact later.
Yeah, we sure do. Also, yeah, we have Little Lord Fuckpants.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that.
Who's Little Lord Fuckpants from the agents? Whose marker is that about Jackie?
That was so funny. I know. They're like, whose marker? They're like looking through a book to see whose marker that is. But yeah, Christopher's really upset, right? Christopher's like, it's all right for me, but not for Jackie. And Tony kind of tries to like rationalize it. He's like, kids today, they're spoiled. Like, like they're not like you. And of course, we see Christopher at other times be referred to as this. It's really small.
Yeah, really small.
And like we see Tony other times talking about how this younger generation, they're all these like yahoos, they do drugs and they're spoiled, right? Which Christopher has been referred to. Now he's kind of passing that on to Jackie as an excuse. And then we get this like, again, like outwardly nice scene where he's like, I love you. You're a good boy. Yeah. And that's it's very fatherly.
Yeah. Strong dialogue for Tony Soprano.
Yeah.
Say you're a good boy. Yeah.
Yeah. We don't hear him say that to well, he does say to AJ, you're a good son.
I think he might even say
You're
those words at one point. Yeah. But
yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting scene, right? It is interesting. Like when we go back to last week's episode with the fortunate son, like, in terms of AJ, like, would Tony see that for AJ? Would he see it for Jackie? Would he see it for
definitely an
Christopher?
extension of the last episode. Yeah. Some of those themes. The only other thing I think I had was, there was like Tony and Melfi's kind of power play throughout the episode in terms of how this is going to resolve itself. And earlier on, Tony kind of pressing her with like, when things get hard,
oh yeah,
pass me on to someone else.
Yeah.
And then Melfi backs off. So
he says that like in an earlier episode too.
Right. And there's also like an extreme close up on Tony. To work out. So this episode is directed by John Patterson, which is interesting because he's typically the director who they assign season finales to.
Right.
But there's always kind of a an importance to these like extreme close-ups of people's faces, and it's interesting how
We
they
have a
use
few of
it
them
in this episode.
Yeah.
But that kind of like actually callousness of Tony, you know, to kind of be aggressive on Melfi, and the fact that she's not sure enough of her
like her reasons behind.
Yeah, exactly, and her principles for guiding her, you know, towards away from Tony. He's able to kind of actually divert
Manipulate her,
and and another thing too that's interesting about that is actually she backs off because she does have the intention of kind of separating herself. He uses that kind of tactic and it works, and then actually right after that is the rape scene. So it kind of like leads right into that. And
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, that's all kind of I have too. It's an interesting episode to talk about because there is so much
and it's so
going on
dominated by the scene on Melfi. I mean, that's such a powerful, emotional, and disturbing scene.
It's also like an action heavy episode, right? Like we're in episode 4 of the season. The first 2 were kind of exploring issues, like they, you know, like the first 2 there wasn't a ton of action. There was a ton of like character development, I would say. But this episode, it's a lot of action. We start to set things up for the season.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you for listening.
Yeah.
We'll be back soon. It's a really incredible season. There's so many amazing episodes. So continue watching, continue listening, and we'll see you next time.